This is, I think, a big reason why we have what I call burnout culture, is that we believe that our jobs define who we are. We believe that we go to work not just expecting a paycheck, but expecting meaning, purpose. I wanted to write it partly to convince myself that there is another way to live your life.
Welcome back to MUZE. I'm very excited for today's guest, John Malesic. You have an incredible book called The End of Burnout: Why Work Drains Us and How to Build Better Lives. I'm super excited about this topic because it is one of those topics that has been requested by the audience, and your book offers a fresh and new perspective on solving this issue. But before we get into the nitty gritty of solving this issue, solving burnout, I think that we need to establish a common ground on what burnout really is and how it manifests in our lives. So, how would you define burnout?
Yeah, well, and first of all, it's just wonderful to be here with you, Kevin, and I hope that we can address some of your readers' concerns. Uh, yeah, I mean this question of how we define burnout is, I think, essential to the problem of burnout that so many people around the world are experiencing. We know that there's something wrong with the way we work. We know that we feel um, overburdened at work. We're not attaining the kind of life that we want, and we're not balancing work well with the rest of our lives. And this has been especially true over the last 2 years, as the pandemic has turned everyone's work upside down to one degree or other. And, everyone feels like they are burned out. And yet, at the same time, when you press people on what burnout means, no one has the same
Mm,
answer. Um, and, that, I think, is the first step to defeating the burnout epidemic, is going to be to define it really well so that we can identify the people who are truly suffering and give them the help they need. So, my definition of burnout is that it's the chronic experience of being stretched between your ideals for work and the reality of your job. So we go into work with all kinds of expectations, not just to earn a salary, but to find meaning and dignity and all of these kind of abstract
purpose.
goods. But then, purpose, exactly, yeah. Um, and we get to work, and those ideals are very often, sometimes they are attained, but very often they are not. And you go to work, and you don't have much autonomy. You are working too much. You have a conflict between your values and your employer, all of those things. And you can go through that for short periods of time without tremendous damage, but over time that just stretches your soul in a way, and causes psychological and personal and physical harm. And now there's when researchers study burnout, they identify three main dimensions of it. One is exhaustion, which I think most of us know what that feels like. Though the exhaustion of burnout is the kind that doesn't get better with rest. You take a long weekend off, you take a vacation, you come back, but you still have the same problem. That's exhaustion. The second is cynicism or depersonalization. When you start viewing the people you work with as less than fully human, For instance, you view them as problems rather than as
Mm.
people. And the third dimension is a feeling of ineffectiveness when your work just doesn't feel like it's accomplishing anything. Um, those three things together are burnout, are the burnout syndrome. Um, and like I've said, my goal in writing this book, one goal partly, is to get our public conversation about burnout to more closely match what scientific researchers are saying about it, so that we can really benefit from the researchers.
So you've mentioned exhaustion, cynicism, and ineffectiveness. How I wonder, do you need to have all three to be burned out, or do you have to? Does only one classify as being burnt out?
Right. Well, that's another very tricky part of the
Mm.
burnout definition, and I view burnout as a spectrum, uh, where someone on one extreme, you have people who are not exhausted, are not cynical, and feel effective and competent at their work, and those people would not be burned out. At the other extreme would be people who exhibit all three symptoms. So they are exhausted, cynical, and they feel like their work isn't accomplishing anything. And so those would be the classical, burnout sufferers. And according to the research I've seen, the not burned out group, and this was research that was done, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, the not burned out group was 45% or so of the study
Mm.
sample, and the kind of full burnout group was 5 to 10%. So then you've still got 40 or 50% of the population is in between
Mhm.
those two. And they have partial forms of burnout. They might be primarily exhausted, but not cynical or ineffective. Or they might be primarily cynical, but not exhausted or ineffective, and so on. And the really interesting research, I think, is trending in the direction of focusing on those, rather than burnout being like a switch, like either you are burned out or you're not burned out, rather it's this spectrum where there are many different ways of to experience it of varying
Mhm.
severity.
How does depression come into place in burnout? Because it's one of those. I think that a lot of people, when they speak about depression, they might also associate towards work, or the other way around. Are you depressed because of work? How does that? How does one fit within the other?
Yeah, I mean the feeling of burnout can sometimes feel like clinical
Hmm.
depression, and vice versa. But I think it's important to keep the two things separate. And the main thing that distinguishes clinical depression from burnout is that clinical depression affects your whole life. You can't, you can't, take a vacation from your depression. Uh, Burnout is focused primarily on your work. Uh, so, in my case, and as I talk about in the book, I was a college professor. Um, and over time, I became more and more miserable in my job. I went to, I did talk therapy to try to figure out what was going on. I went on antidepressant medication that only helped a little. The one thing that worked that got me over burnout was quitting my job. I quit my job and I started to
Hmm.
get better because the problem was focused on my job. I can remember my therapist said, "You don't have clinical depression. Like, it's just, I just don't fit those criteria." Though research shows that there is often a lot of overlap between burnout and depression. And people who feel uh, very burned out by their work probably ought to be screened for clinical
Mm.
depression, um, because that's often a much more serious condition that they need real help for. Um, if they go around saying, "Oh, I'm burned out. It's no big deal," that can conceal an even deeper problem that doesn't just have to do with their work. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that in addition to getting really clear on the definition of burnout, we need to be very clear about the difference between burnout and depression.
Okay, interesting. Um, you've mentioned your journey throughout the having your own burnout. You said that in the beginning that your expectations didn't meet the satisfaction that you got from your job. But this, in your case, and you correct me if I'm wrong, this is not because of like any monetary values, but because of the values that you would get out of being a professor.
Exactly. Yeah. I knew what to expect in terms of salary, and I got that. And in fact, I think my job was very satisfactory monetarily. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I I wanted to be a professor from almost the first time I met my own professors at university. I I envied their lives. They just seemed to live, the life of the mind, and that really appealed to me. And so I did the things that you need to do to get that job, and I eventually did.
Mm-hmm.
And there absolutely were times when I was teaching that felt like the life of the mind, that fulfilled the ideals that I had for this work. But it was also a lot of drudgery. And
Mm.
the students, and again, I want to say, like, I had many wonderful students, but the students did not. I taught theology, and
Can you
not
just explain what theology is? Because in Europe, it might be a little bit different.
right. Well, yeah, right. In Europe, often the people who are studying theology are primarily the clergy, and that's to some degree that's true in the United States, but the college where I taught was Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the students were required to take theology. So if you wanted a degree in biology or business or something, you just had to take this as a required
Okay.
course, as part of your kind of general education. So right, my as you can imagine, if you go in pursuit of a business degree, but then the college tells you, well, you have to study theology also, um, that might be disappointing to you. And, so I had dedicated my life to this intellectual pursuit. And I get into the classroom, and the students are sometimes telling me to my face, this class doesn't matter to us.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you taking it so seriously? We're not here to learn what you have to teach. We're here for a different reason. And that really wears on you. I mean, that's that ineffectiveness, that sense that I've designed this really interesting class, and I've tried very hard to reach the students, even students who are very skeptical about what I'm trying to teach, and to have that met with indifference is very painful. Uh, and so that was a factor in my burnout. And in addition, just all of the administrative aspects of being a professor, the various kinds of paperwork and meetings and things like that, assessment, all, you know, those were the parts of the job that I didn't see my own professors doing, right?
Mm.
Uh, and so I developed this image of what the job was like that was unrealistic. I thought it was, you know, sitting around and reading Plato and Nietzsche and Thomas Aquinas all the time, but it's not like that.
Would you say that if you were in another college where the class wouldn't be required, do you think that the college job would have worn so much on you
That's
that you would
that's
still have a burnout or not? Do you think that would have changed?
yeah, that's hard to say. I sometimes wish I still could be a university professor because I think I was good at it at times. I think
Mm-hmm.
it matches the skills and the passions that I have. And I still do teach part time. I don't teach theology anymore. Now I teach writing. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, what I always say is that what's really a factor in whether or not you burn out is that gap between ideals and reality. So I suppose that if I had been teaching in conditions where the reality was a little closer to my ideals, and honestly, if my ideals were probably a little more realistic, then yeah, I mean, I would not have undergone burnout.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with, you know, dozens of colleagues who did not uh, burn out while doing, you know, basically the same job. So yeah, there probably there probably was a way that I could have if I had been at a different institution, possibly, but not necessarily, just because
Mm-hmm.
I still brought those ideals, and the conditions are pretty common across North American higher education.
So do you think that your other your colleagues had different ideals, or the first thing that pops into my mind as you're talking about, well, they don't go through burnout, is that doesn't time heal the fact of going, like, getting used to the situation, kind of readjust the ideals that I have towards a job and I normalize the situation that I'm currently in. Hence, I prevent burnout.
Right. Yeah, and in in burnout research, there's a fairly consistent finding that uh, researchers find burnout is negatively correlated with age. So what that means is that when they take a picture of a population of workers, the older ones show a lower level of burnout on average than the younger ones.
Mm-hmm.
And what you described could be one reason for it. You figure out how to prevent burnout as you continue in the career. But another very likely possibility is that the people who burn out early in their careers just leave the career. And so then they go and they find something else to do, and one that they can do in a more sustainable way. And so the ones who remain are the ones who, for whatever reason, did not suffer burnout. Um, so I don't think that researchers have really figured out kind of which it necessarily is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, but whether we just kind of get better at dealing with it, or if it's just that all the people who are most susceptible to it switch careers, so they don't stick around.
How much does us linking ourselves, our identity, towards our jobs have to do with, like, the likelihood of us getting a burnout, or does is there a link at all in your mind, like in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that there's a huge link, and I think that you see that this is I think a big reason why we have what I call burnout culture, in, in North America, in Europe, and around the world is that we believe that our jobs define who we are. We believe that we go to work not just expecting a paycheck, but expecting meaning, purpose. We're going to prove ourselves as good people, good citizens, good providers, all of that. Uh, and that's just an incredibly high expectations for work. That's just more than I think work can really deliver. And so I think that on a societal level, the way to end a burnout culture is going to be partly to lower our ideals and expectations, to not to expect to find our lives fulfilled at our jobs.
Interesting. That is the one sentence that is kind of completely on the opposite spectrum of what we hear from a lot of self-help gurus. And to be fair, like myself included, I also believe that there is a space where you can work, where you're getting, you are fulfilled. Because like completely honestly speaking, the reason why I left my last job is because of this unfulfillment. So you try to find this fulfillment somewhere else. And so how do we get fulfilled in the end? If it's not with our jobs, which is like a third of our lifetime. That's the calculation, right? We have a third of our lifetime is our job, so we might as well use it in something that we feel fulfilled in.
Right. It's a third of our lifetime for a certain portion of our lives, for the middle of our lives. And I think that recognizing that is part of the key to ending burnout culture and rethinking how work fits into our lives. Because we spend the first however many years, 16, 18, 20 years, for the most part, not working.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think unfortunately, children are often told school is your job. There's all this pressure for them to start identifying themselves with their work, quote unquote, um, from an early age. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a terrible idea. School is not
Okay.
their job. School has value in and of itself. Um, and then we reach adulthood, and yeah, work for most people takes up a lot of time. Like you say, about a third or so of our lives, though, not counting weekends, holidays, and so on. Um, but still, there are quite a few adults who don't work, partly, uh, or don't work for pay at any rate. You think about parents who are not working outside the home. What they do has value apart from its economic value. Or people with disabilities who are unable to work full time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then suddenly you get to older age and it's fine not to work. No one gets mad at a 70-year-old person who is not working. Um, we only get mad at like a 40-year-old person who isn't. And to me that's just a strange kind of um, view of the value of human life, that for these 30 or 40 or 50 years in the middle of life, you were defined by work. And we don't expect that later in life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I would want us to start to see value in non-work areas of life from childhood and through adulthood and midlife and on into retirement, to recognize that it's the stuff outside of work that is the primary source of meaning and value and purpose and dignity. Um, And work itself exists to support those other activities that give life value.
So we should find value in anything that is not work related, in our leisure, in our relationships, in our the things that we love doing. But so I'm curious again, and this is like me just randomly asking, is there a place where we can work without where we can work on something that we are passionate about, where we that we love doing, that fulfills us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are all kinds of places. One one is the family, for instance,
Mm,
um, and there is definitely a lot of pressure on parents to identify parenting as a form of labor too, because if labor is how you become a legitimate adult and a participant in society, and you're at home largely raising children, you have to redefine that as labor in order to legitimate your own life.
mm-hmm,
I would say that parenting has value, and I should add I am not a parent, but parenting has value regardless of the effort that goes into it.
mm-hmm,
That parenting has value, um, not because it's like work. In so many ways, it's not like work. For instance, you're not paid. You can't quit. You can't get fired. You can't form a union against your children to, get um, greater concessions from them. Um, and right, it's often considered a great source of joy, um, in spite of the drudgery of it. And so,
mm-hmm,
I think that parenting could be something that we should view not as, primarily like work, but as something with a good being good in itself. So I mean, hobbies, parenting, like you said, relationships, um, community activity, and religious activity as well. Uh, One place that I went looking to find alternatives was in a Benedictine monastery in the middle of a desert in the state of New Mexico. And the monks there, they certainly live unusual lives. It's a community of about 60 men. Uh, they live, very far from any other, uh, town or anything like that. And they have to be as self-sustaining as possible.
mm-hmm,
And yet they work about 3 or 4 hours a day, because to them, their life of communal prayer is much more important than their labor. Well, I mean, the labor exists so that they can maintain their community, and the community is there so that they can pray together primarily. Uh,
mm-hmm,
and so for them, they've found something that is more important than work. And I think the lesson here is not, well, everybody should just join a monastery, but rather that those of us who live in the secular world need to identify those things that are more important than work, those things that for which we are working, the things that our work serves and supports, rather than
mm-hmm.
make work the highest end of our existence.
And based on that, then we kind of reschedule our life, our calendar, and our priorities. I think that's always the thing, right? We have so many things to do, work included, and or like even people that want to do something based on their passions and like create their online business or something very small on the side. They have like it's very difficult. A lot of people say they don't have enough time because they don't know how to prioritize what is important to them. But once you know what is important to you, you can reschedule your calendar and essentially prevent the burnout.
Right. And I think that a very important aspect of this is that that is very hard to do on your
Yes.
own.
Yes.
um, and this is part of why, these monks, they aren't hermits. They don't each live in individual, um, hermitages, totally isolated from each other. They live in community, and they have community rules to make it easier to schedule their lives in a way that helps them to attain the goals that they set. If
Mm-hmm.
you're just the one person on your team at work who is like, well, sorry, it's 5 p.m., I'm not going to respond to emails anymore. Well, suddenly you become a problem to your
Mm-hmm.
boss, and you very well may lose your job. If, however, there's a company wide norm set that, all right, we're not going to, no one is obligated to respond to work emails after 5 p.m. or 7 p.m. or whatever. In fact, the Canadian province of Ontario, and I think also this has happened in Europe too, is pushing recently passed legislation that will push companies to set those rules, um, so that the person who wants to draw boundaries around their work is not doing it alone, so that they can
Mm-hmm.
feel legitimated in having those boundaries.
You having gone through a burnout, have you, like, did your definition of success and maybe even happiness
Mhm.
change after you've gone through the burnout? And what was it like pre-burnout, if it happened, pre-burnout and post-burnout recovery?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. I think
Those are
that
the questions that we want.
right, yeah. I think that I had not not necessarily consciously, but I had really defined my happiness in terms of my work.
Mm-hmm.
That if I got a job as a college professor, if I earned tenure, if I had, these publications or something like that, if I won these awards, then I was living a good life. And that was a huge mistake, um, for many reasons. But um, yeah, now I, the fact is, like, I preach this view of work a little better than I practice it. I
Mm.
still probably put a little too much emphasis on my accomplishments. Um, but I think I'm getting better, for one thing. And I no longer have a full time job. So I write, I work as a freelance writer. I, set my own schedule and my own goals on that. Uh, and I teach still part time. And what that means is that no one thing kind of is my entire identity. Uh, if and I don't well, and partly like I don't invest everything that I am and that I have in my classes now. Partly because I know that, well, the writing is really important to me, and I'm going to do the best job I can in the classroom. But if class doesn't go well, that is not an indictment of my entire life. If class does go well, that's great, but that doesn't validate my entire life. Um, and I think that yeah, I mean, I am a little bit better at, finding meaning elsewhere, in hobbies and in relationships. I am married, and my relationship with my wife is very important, of course. Um, so yeah, like it's a journey for me too. I'm not at the destination.
I guess that's for all of us, right?
Right. Well, and this is just like a thing like that I think is true of a lot of writers. We write in order to convince ourselves that something is
Mm.
true. In many ways, I wrote this book for someone like me who maybe has over identified with work and finds it unsatisfying. Um, but in another sense, I wrote it really for me to be like, dear John, you need to believe this. I wanted to write it partly to, yeah, to convince myself that there is another way to live your life.
Hmm. I think that we all do that. Like, not just like writers, coaches, teachers, they are always teaching themselves. Even though it sounds like it's not about you, in some way it's always going to be about you. I think like it happens for you that you have written a book about burnout, but that is not just for John, it's a book for nearly everyone that has at least partially gone through the process of burning out. And I think that every single person on earth, or let's just say 95% of people, like this is not scientifically proven, of course, but let's just say 95% of people have gone through some kind of similar feelings of either exhaustion, cynicism, or loss of identity. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. At least I hope I hope it's true that that this message will resonate with many people.
No, I think it will. And at least I hope so too as well. Um, to end this conversation, I have a few like a fast questions. So the first question is, what is the best advice that you've ever been given? I like when you think. When you take the
Well,
time to think, that's a really good sign.
yeah, I guess it's two pieces of advice from my parents.
Ooh, nice.
One of them I use as the epigram to the book, and I don't know if it's good advice, but it's something that I think about a lot. And it's from my father, who said, "You don't have to like it. That's why it's called work."
Mm.
Um, that's a very kind of pragmatic view of work, not very idealistic, and I am arguing in a way uh, towards a more realistic view of work, but at the same time, I can't fully embrace my own father's view. Related, my mother would often say, don't wish your life away. So I would say like,
Mm.
I wish that I, had this thing, or I wish that I was older. I wish I was out of school or something like that. And in doing so, you're kind of skipping over all of the great experience that is possible here and now. That's something I constantly need to remind myself when I'm facing difficulty, and I'd say, gosh, I wish that it were, if only it were, this time next week I'll be done with this difficult thing. Well, that's a whole week of my life that I'm saying I don't want to experience. Um,
Mm.
but and that I'm never gonna have that week again. Our lives are finite, and yeah, we should not hope to get beyond any part of them. As there's joy to be found, uh, you know, at every point. Uh,
Hmm. I love that.
Sorry, that was not a quick answer.
But that's good. That's good. That's elaborate answer.
Yeah.
The second question is, what is the worst advice that you've ever been given?
Oh gosh. I mean, you know, something like do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life, or something like that. That's pretty
The,
bad. Uh, I think that's the kind of advice that leads to the problem that we're facing right now. Not that we shouldn't. Not that it's bad to do what you love for work, um, but love will not pay the bills, and that kind of love will often go away.
Hmm. And the last question is, what would you like to leave as advice for the audience that is listening right now?
Yeah, the for the audience, I think that what I want to tell them is to think about what they expect from work. What material rewards, what non-material rewards do they expect? To ask if their actual job is living up to them, to those ideals, and then to talk about that, to talk about the ideals, the reality, where the gap between them might be with their coworkers, their friends, their partners, whoever. Because the only way, your burnout and my burnout are connected. Um, it's other people at work, at people who are our customers and the people for whom we are customers who cause our burnout. And that means that I contribute to your burnout and vice versa. And we're only going to solve each other's burnout, and we're only going to solve burnout on the large scale if we can all admit that there is this problem, that we're all implicated in it, and that it emerges from both our ideals from work and our reality. And if we can start talking about that, we might be able to start aligning ideals and reality a little bit better on a large scale.
I love that. I absolutely love that. It's all about communication and solving each other's problems.
Right.
Great. John, I want to say thank you. I absolutely love this conversation, and I am so sure that this will have an impact, at least to my audience. They have been requesting this, and the thing is, burnout is something that is not talked about enough. And in my environment, every single, like, I have heard from most, like, every single person that they have experienced some kind of it. Like, after having heard your definition of, like, the spectrum of burnout, I have heard at least one person tell me that they have felt some similar feeling. And the first step towards change is always being aware that there is something, that there is something that is wrong. And I think that your book is clearly delivering that spectrum. And I hope that we can change the culture of burnout for the future, because it's definitely something that we do not want to live with in the future.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.